Hi, I'm Ashley Gordon,
And I'm Kirk Kernut.
and this is Reading for the Rest of Us.
Well, here we are, and it is December, the holiday season. And
They
so
are upon us.
I thought, or we thought, for this show that what we would do is talk about, it seems natural to talk about the culture of giving books.
Yes.
But in particular, you suggested that we focus on something. There's
look,
some nice
look, we
backdrop for us.
Yeah.
But you suggested in particular that we focus on a certain segment of the audience.
Yes, boys.
Boys.
For a couple of reasons.
Okay.
Well, one thing is we are all boy families here. You have boy.
Boy.
I have boys.
Boys.
And a brother who's kind of like my boy. He's a lot younger. Has always been sort of jointly owned with my mom. And then our wonderful and supportive crew are also boy families, one completely boy family and one half and half. So Kowalski has a boy and a girl, and Ronnie has his own tribe.
Brood of boys.
Yes, his brood of boys. So with all of us having this boy world around us, and also because there is the impression and probably the reality that boys don't read as much as girls and men don't read as much as women, at least for fun.
Right.
At least reading fiction just for the enjoyment of reading. So we thought that coming up with gifts for men and boys that were book related, and also books that would be great father-son reads that you could do together, because a lot of us with our boys, they might be a little taciturn, they maybe don't talk to us quite as much as the girls do, and so finding something to share with them and to talk about with them would be not just a gift at Christmas, but something that gives all year long.
Yeah. Reading really is a great joint activity. We often think of it as a solitary thing, but reading together, reading books, passing along books, talking about books is really a way to build bonding.
To bond, yeah.
And I think especially for men, where there's the notion of that we aren't allowed to explore feelings or whatever, that's really a cultural sort of idea. But I think books are one way that allows men to kind of come sideways at that sort of prohibition, and allows us to make contact with our children in ways. You did some interesting research, and I think it's almost a little scary, some of the figures that you came up with about how what percentage of men are reading and what percentage of men who are reading novels
What it is
in
they're
particular.
reading. Yeah. So the Pew Institute did a study in 2013 of people who had read a book in the past year, and the numbers really were not that far apart. It was 82% of women had read a book in the previous year and 69% of men. So really not that big of a delta. But when you look at what they were reading, only 20% of men admitted to, at least, reading fiction and reading for fun. And the same is true in children.
Yeah.
Girls are far more likely to read for fun, and some of the conjecture is that they're able to sit still longer. They have a greater emotional range, and when I read that, I thought we really didn't need to pay for a study to figure out that women have a greater emotional range than men, but okay. So girls have an easier time with empathy. And
Right.
reading fiction is really, as Neil Gaiman just was quoted on Twitter recently, saying that books are an empathy machine. I mean, they help you understand someone else's perspective, and you actually get to get out from inside your own head and into the head of somebody else. And it's one of the few ways that we can do that.
Right. I think historically, too, there's also the issue of that when the novel first became an art form, it was identified as a women's diversion.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
true.
the first century or so that novels were around, it was all attached with all the patriarchal culture really worrying about the effect of reading fiction or make-believe that would have on women. So I think it's very important to encourage men to read not only read books but to read novels. And you're precisely right that the benefits of reading, in many ways even more than nonfiction, I think force you out of your own particular world, your own particular likes and interests, into identifying with other people.
Well, it can't be too awful because my kids love Diary of a Wimpy Kid, or the
Sure.
Smalls as we refer to them. They both have read those and they laugh right out loud. And
Yeah.
I hear them laughing, and it's not because they're watching a movie or the Disney Channel. They're reading. So it's they're and maybe they are learning something about what it's like to be in middle school for Greg Heffley, but really they're just having fun.
Yeah.
So books can be fun.
You know, I do a lot of book clubs, and stereotypically,
Drink a lot of wine, do you?
Eat a lot of crackers. Stereotypically, they are composed of a majority of women.
But led by a man?
No, well, very rarely.
What do you say? What do you
honestly.
mean when you say you do book clubs?
Well,
Boy,
go
we're not
go
going to
and
go too deeply
go,
into that, but
go
like, do you
just
lead them?
attend
You-
as a sort
participant.
Of, yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Get
so you're
invited
not
to
like there as
because-
the English teacher
Oh,
to help
no,
them understand
no,
what they've
no,
read.
no.
Okay, because some do that.
Yeah. I only do that if I'm getting paid to do that, and I don't get paid to do that a whole lot. So, but when you attend those, I always like to ask women, what are your husbands reading? And a lot of times when they talk about the fact their husbands only read nonfiction, you ask them why. There's a perception of they always, to a T, they always say they're too busy. They're reading nonfiction.
Too busy to read for pleasure.
Right. Well, they're reading autobiographies for pleasure. They're reading sports books for pleasure. I think the perception is that somehow fiction is always more about pleasure than it is about edification or about learning.
So the reading has to be productive in some way
Yeah,
for them to
yeah.
allow themselves the time
And I
to
think
do
that
it.
that fits into that notion of men being sort of task-oriented, and the idea of a guy kicking back with with a book about family or a book about relationships somehow isn't a productive use of time.
But maybe if they were better at relationships, like maybe if we could convince them that reading about relationships would help them be better
Sure.
at relationships,
And
which I
talking
bet
about-
the women in the world would say was really productive.
I would agree with you 100% on that.
Just a
but
thought.
Of course, we're readers. So
I know we're not in
prejudiced.
charge. I know we're not in
Let's
charge.
talk about some of the books that we brought today. And I want to start with one that I really love that you've had here a couple times. Let's look at The Little Prince, because that is a book that, to me, I remember when my son was young, very young,
Baby.
and that was one of the first books that we sort of shared with him and read to him. But you have a version of The Little Prince.
This is very gifty.
Yes. That is
I'm
a...
gonna reach over and grab
go
it.
ahead
And when I was picking books for this, I wanted books that would span the ages, and also that we road tested. So this book was, I'll hold it still. This book was, if your little prince is maybe not here yet or is just getting here, this is a wonderful gift for somebody who's having a baby. And as you said, it's a good book to share. The story certainly is powerful, but this particular one is a pop-up book.
Yeah. Now, pop-up books are great.
See,
First off,
This is
pop-up
my
books
favorite
remind us
image.
that bookmaking is a craft.
Yes.
And that's part of the fun of it, is to really see how much labor
See.
goes into the production of books. We're never going to have a
It's really
pop-up
gorgeous.
ebook. I mean, I'm just assuming that
No.
that technology...
No, and it's kind of hard to give ebooks. What are you going to send somebody an iTunes card and say,
Yeah.
please buy this book with it?
Right.
It's really difficult to
Yeah.
do that. And it's also difficult to share it. Part of what makes gifting of books so much fun is that if you're both reading it, like what we'll talk about with some of the father-son books, and you can read it at the same time, particularly if you're in the same house. And then I've read it and now I give it to you, and the passing it
Right.
on, quite literally, it's hard to do with ebooks.
Yeah. Ebooks
So,
are,
this is a
pop-up books
beautiful
are
one.
also great because physically you're manipulating the book. You get in there and it has levers
There we go.
and circles.
For that
and
mail thing,
Yeah.
where you need it
So
to
it's a
be
great
a
opportunity.
physical experience.
You know, I remember being a kid, and when we used to make books, we used to, take paper and staple it and fold it all together.
Yep.
And part of the fun was is making our own pop-up books. They never
That's
ever
impressive.
looked well. They were never ever as good as this, but they were fun to make because you learned how to use all the moving parts. So
Kinda
there's
like
a sort of
origami.
mechanical element
Trying
to
think.
pop-up
So
books.
it's a beautiful one.
Yeah.
It's a lovely story, and it makes a particularly wonderful gift.
Right, right. Let's talk about, I think if there's one genre that probably boys are drawn to maybe more than any other, it's fantasy.
Yep.
And so we were talking about Tolkien.
Yeah, this is an easy one. We also, the books I picked also have movies that go with them that are all coming out this holiday season or right around it. So if, like in our case, it's a whole lot easier for me to get the Smalls to read than the Spousal Unit.
Right.
But if I want them to all be discussing the same story, we can at least all go watch the movie together. Or if you have a reluctant reader, as we call it in the business, then maybe see the movie first, because this was a great story that Ronnie had about Lord of the Rings. His son loves the movies, and they watched them together, and didn't even know, his son didn't know that they came from books.
Sure.
So not only do you have, and there are just tons of them, so The Hobbit is the movie that's coming out this fall, and not only do you have the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, but there's just become this entire industry around Tolkien, and he was so prolific as a writer. In fact, at Christmas, one of our very favorite books is Letters from Father Christmas that Tolkien wrote and illustrated to his son Christopher and the other boys as they came along. And it's also a pop-up book of sorts in that you pull the letters out and you read them, and so there are all kind of Tolkien opportunities, and I'll list all these on our Facebook post, but particularly The Hobbit is accessible in a way that maybe The Lord of the Rings might not be if they haven't started reading yet. It's an adventure story, so it's a great book for both father and son. And it certainly has overtones of World War II and history, other languages and other cultures. And then there's the movie. And we've seen the first two and love them both. And
I think the great thing about the Tolkien books is you can read those as for fantasy as a child, but you keep coming back to them as adults and discovering all those other layers.
More depth and layers.
Right. And it really is creation of a kind of an alternative universe, where you get swept up in really understanding the way that this world works.
If they liked Harry Potter, if they like Percy Jackson or any of the Rick Riordan, that create an alternative world with its own languages and vocabulary and types of beings, then these are wonderful. And my brother also loves these, so it really becomes like a family thing when my boys will ask me, well, Mom, what happened in, or can orcs do this, or is that, I don't know, ask Uncle Will. So it's a real bridge for them, despite their 20-year age difference. It's something that they really share and they look forward to. Not unlike Star Wars, but...
Sure. Well, it's interesting because you were talking about the sort of the culture of tie-in books, and when I was a child, before I was 10 years old, the first books that really got me reading were Star Trek books. And there was this whole industry of at first it was serializations where they would do a novel version of a TV show, but then they started producing original novels based on the series.
Yeah, like Star Wars has done.
Yeah, exactly. And the great thing about it is it's a fun way to get beyond the movies and get beyond
something
the TV
deeper.
show. Yeah,
yeah. When you want more,
and you really start craving that the more.
Well, and then the fan fiction, which we've talked about on this show before. You still don't get enough, so you just make up your own and extend it even further.
Right.
So.
Another sort of institution that you brought to sort of demonstrate, I think, the way that appeals across the generations is Sherlock Holmes. Now,
these are great.
I'll be the first to admit that sometimes I have a hard time with Sherlock Holmes. It's just a little too little too stuffy for me sometimes, and so it's fun for me to imagine how a young man would be drawn into that world. What do you think the appeal of a Sherlock Holmes is?
I think part of it is the puzzle
Okay.
aspect.
Sure.
That it is the figuring it out. Can I beat him? I think there's a really clear distinction in the bad guy and the good guy. It's an early version of the police procedural,
Yeah.
which are a hugely popular genre with adults, and I think even men must read a lot of those.
Yeah.
And also we have the media crossover now with the fantastic BBC PBS
Right.
series with Benedict Cumberbatch, who happens to be the voice of Smaug, and his partner, who of course isn't as interestingly named, so I don't know his name, but he's also Bilbo and Watson. So all kind of crossovers here. So and we've got the movies, the recent movies of Sherlock Holmes, and also Elementary, which okay.
There's a whole cultural history
Yeah.
that you're drawn into discovering through
So,
those media.
so you watch the television show and then you want more, and then to be able to go back to the original story, it's fascinating because
Right.
they really do, at least on the PBS version, they really take the skeleton of the original story and transplant it, much like we do with Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Moving it all around, it becomes a universal story.
Tell me about this particular book, because
Okay,
I'm
how to think like
intrigued
Sherlock. So, and this is, it was a gift from my dad to my boys. So yet another, this is a grandfather, grandson sort of thing, because he loved Sherlock Holmes and reads a lot of detective fiction, and this was sort of his entree into that genre. So my kid, who likes puzzles and likes history and likes figuring things out, to look at the thought process behind how Sherlock Holmes does and the science behind those stories, the journalism and the different things that were evolving at the time those books were being written is really fascinating. So this is a great grandfather-grandson
Sure.
bridge and gift and thing to do together.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that you can have mystery novels, and then you can take a step back and think about it's almost like reading a book about chess. You know, it's a strategy book in a sense. You take a step back and you're thinking about the
And two sides, there's the detective and there's the villain,
Right.
and each moves and they move in response to the other's moves. That's a great analogy. I've never
Yeah.
thought of it like that.
Yeah, I think, and that's one way of I think of sort of teaching young men the idea that books can help you think better, and that there's ways of learning from books that can be fun if you think in terms of the strategies and the analogies
And
that you can come
understanding
up with.
people and why they do what they
Sure,
do,
sure.
which certainly is practical.
You mentioned science, and you brought a couple other books about boy scientists and young scientists.
Yeah, these are just great, gifty. If you have a kid who's interested in science, and this is an Alabama, one of our dignitaries, or
Right.
luminaries rather,
Right.
Edward O. Wilson, Letters to a Young Scientist. So it's his generational outreach to his being a scientist and what it was like for him as a boy and how to embrace science
Yeah.
as a kid, and then just fun ones. The Boy Scientist, which is actual experiment, so buy this one at your own risk, or maybe this is a great gift from grandparents to your child who really misbehaved all through high school, and now he has his own, and you want to get back at them.
This is what you do with the chemistry set in the basement,
Right,
blowing
right.
things
Oh,
up.
yeah, only use this when you go back home.
That's right.
And this is one that's been around for a while, but if the kids are just coming
This
up.
book fascinates me.
The
Tell me-
dangerous
yeah.
book for boys.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So fun things that boys can do, projects, and kind of like the idea of science experiments, like bugs, and so it's not really dangerous, but it's the rambunctious. It's the physical nature. We were talking about this before with Kowalski and Ronnie, and why don't you read, and
Yeah.
what do you do with your kids, and looking at the pictures. Well, every picture we're out, hiking or or surfing or doing something. So the dangerous book for boys is all kind of fun stuff to do that maybe you shouldn't do.
And I think part of the fun of these types of books is it really encourages us to think of whatever we do, of always having a book there,
A guide.
as a guide or as a reference to it.
As a companion, too.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not doing it alone.
You know, I grew up as a kid with, you know, riding bikes and skateboarding and all of that. And, you know, the greatest thing was you always had a paperback in your back pocket at the
Really?
same time. Oh, yeah, yeah. So, you know,
I'm not sure that's
books,
universal.
Books, well, I don't think it is. And, but that's the,
we should test that one.
well, you know, we should
But then
have,
you did come to paperbacks from a Beatles
That's true. That's true. Well,
spin-off.
you know, music is a perfect example of this because you know, I know many musicians and many people who, you know, who love to listen to music. And, you know, the reality for me is I'm a huge music fan, but I've never been a part of that world where books also weren't a part of it, to where I wasn't drawn to biographies or stories
Well,
of
there are
how
lots
the
of books
music's
about the
made.
sort of underground music culture,
Sure,
right?
sure. Lots of books about the sort of the history of the medium of rock and roll, but also the subcultures that pop up.
Well, is that where you got the
Well,
the
yeah.
Jerry Lee Lewis
in
book?
fact, you know, another one of our Alabama stars, Rick Bragg, has a new book that is fascinating biography of Jerry Lee Lewis. Of course, you know, Jerry Lee Lewis has been with us all along, and we've, you know, if you're of a certain age, you've grown up hearing the stories and the legends about him, and you know his contributions to 1950s rock and roll. But it's when you crack open a book that you discover the culture that's behind that music, and you really get these wonderful descriptions of sort of the clash between blues culture and between the gospel white culture and the church and the boogie woogie piano, and you realize what a cauldron.
And from our end, it's already been, we've already had it all come together.
Yeah.
So we get it as a finished product.
Right, and I'm going to go out on a limb here because there's tons of, you know, there's Jerry Lee movies and documentaries. I don't think that those representations of it can do justice to the cultural background, because they get so caught up in the wild and crazy stories that you really don't get a sense of, you know, how did this particular person pop out of this world. And I think one of the benefits of a book like this is you realize Jerry Lee Lewis was almost an inevitable product of this Southern culture, this clash of little Southern pieces of culture. It's almost like you're amazed that there aren't more of him running around.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the book for the father-son.
Sure.
You're interested in music.
Well, I think
you know, normally you give him an album, but again,
Yeah.
if he wants music, you can't really, an iTunes card is beyond anonymous and boring. So you give him this instead,
Right.
and then maybe introduce him to music that he's not heard before,
Sure.
and that y'all can share together.
Let's move into talking about gifts to men, or gifts from men to men, because believe it or not, we do give gifts to other men, and encouraging reading. I think if we talk about nonfiction, men are drawn toward stories that have some element of survival or adventure, and you brought a copy of Unbroken
Yeah.
here, which is about
But I wasn't
to be
thinking men to
released.
men.
Well, tell us
But
a little
that's
bit about
interesting that
what
you think of it that way. So this is a story of a young man who started off as a degenerate, really. He was sort of voted most likely to end up in jail. And his older brother took him under his wing and got him into cross-country running. And through that, he became an Olympian and then went on to serve in World War II and ultimately was captured by the Japanese and was a prisoner of war for many years. And this is by Laura Hillenbrand, and this book is not new. It's been on the bestseller
Right.
list for 3 years at least. But on Christmas Day, there is a movie being released, directed by Angelina Jolie, which I think is really cool, of his story.
Right.
And what he has in common, what every aspect of his life has in common is his unwillingness to give up.
Sure.
So his sort of determining characteristic is just stubbornness. It's
Yeah.
almost a bullheadedness. He will not quit.
And the great thing about books like this is it really is teaching ethics and values. It's not doing it in a preaching way. It's doing it through narrative.
It is
and
an
it's
adventure,
yeah,
like you said.
It's demonstrating the resilience that I think most people, men or women, hope that they would be able to have in these types of situations.
And she does a good job in the same way that you mentioned what Rick Bragg does with Jerry Lee Lewis. She does a good job of placing this in a larger context of what was going on at the Olympics in Berlin when he competed, and
right.
World War II, and how his life was inevitable in some ways. His reaction to it was not. That was remarkable.
Yeah.
But the path that he followed, he was very much a person of his time, and then sort of did something extraordinary beyond what was happening in his own time.
Just in case people forgot, her previous book was Seabiscuit.
Seabiscuit.
And that is another...
and see, this one got me. That's a great book. But then we also have Monuments Men,
yeah.
which is a great movie. And both my boys and husband loved the movie, and then talking about World War II. For the younger set, I want to make sure we get this one in here, because this is also a movie, and it looks so adorable. I cannot wait for it, although it's not till January. So my 10, almost 11-year-old has been reading Paddington, and we've been reading it with him. And the movie looks wonderful, and the books are adorable. So this is a great gift coming up, you know, and then we can all go see the movie together. And one more in that same vein is the How to Train Your Dragon series.
Oh, yeah.
These are great. There are at least 12 of them. We've read them all. And the movie just came out on DVD. So it's another good combo. Here's the movie, here's the book. And the whole family went to see the movie in the theater, and we all laughed out loud and thoroughly enjoyed it. So these are good, you know, sort of 8 to 12-ish boy, and even girls. There are plenty of girls that enjoy these too, and certainly the movies are fun.
Yeah, one of the things we want to emphasize is that we really do, I think, as both as educators and readers and just people who love books, want to break down these barriers between
that's the whole point.
Men and women, and what we're able
but
and
we're
willing to read.
creating the gateway,
right?
You know, just
right.
Okay, what's to get them in? All right, we can't not
we
get
can't,
to yours. Your
we're
last
gonna,
one.
We're going to wrap up with a book that very local significance.
Very much so.
Very much
And aren't we
trained
proud?
in Montgomery, but it's a great book, I think, as to sort of encourage people. It's what I would call an inspirational book, in the sense that it demonstrates how each of us individually can cultivate a vision of social justice or of contributing to our culture. This is Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy, and of course Bryan Stevenson here in Montgomery, Alabama, executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, came to Montgomery specifically 25 years ago in order to address inequalities in the justice system. And this is his story of why it is important for all of us, really, to be socially conscious and to care.
I think he would also qualify as hard-headed.
Yes.
He is stuck to that vision,
Right.
and no matter what happens, he still believes in it, and how amazing for us that he does, and that he's sharing it with us.
And he does it in a way that I think is personally challenging to each of us, because the questions that this book asks is, are you willing to live in a culture that allows this to be done to other people? So it's a way of sort of conceptualizing ethics, again through narrative. I mean, it's great storytelling. So
that's much like Unbroken. It's, you know, what do you want your life to be, and will you let external circumstances determine who you become?
And we keep coming back to the main word for reading, which is empathy, and that's really what we're talking about. Yep. So this was a fast half hour.
It was. We had a lot to cover. And we will put the list on Facebook. We'll share it.
So we're going to wrap up, but as we do, being proud parents that we are, we thought we would go ahead and just show you some of our pictures of our children.